Now, there are four basic principles of conservatism as well. And these are basically diametrically opposed to the four basic principles of the left. Those four basic principles are, number one, that mankind is inherently flawed, that it's possible that we can be good, we can be evil, but that's why nobody can be given ultimate power, because we all have the capacity to do great harm to one another and to do great evil to one another. It's why liberty is necessary. Liberty is necessary because if any one of us were ever to be in charge, then we'd have a real problem on our hands. This is written in the Federalist Papers. I mean, Federalist 51 says it straight out, where it talks about if men were angels, no government would be necessary, and if men were devils, then no government would be sufficient. Right? The idea is that mankind is capable of doing great harm and great good. The left doesn't believe that. The left actually has two different concepts of what humanity constitutes, and they conflict with each other. The first is that human beings are basically completely malleable widgets at the whims of the universe and of the society around them. Right? This is why the idea that, I mean, the famous Marxist line that men are born free and yet everywhere they're in chains, right? That men are inherently good. Rousseau's concept is that men are inherently good and that society makes them bad. But the Marxist idea is that men are basically just there and society makes them evil if it's a capitalist society. Unfortunately, Marxism shows that that is a lie, that no matter what system you put people in, people are people, and some of them will do good things and some of them will do bad things. But the idea that if you just change the system, you magically transform the hearts of men is sheer nonsense. People are selfish, and people are cruel, and people are vindictive, and people are good, and people are generous. And that is the reality of human life. And we all know that on a personal level, but in order to achieve that goal of equality and fairness, we have to pretend that all human beings are basically just at the mercy of the system. If you change the system, then magically everything changes. It's a contradiction in the sense that society is made up of individuals. So how can you possibly say that society defines every individual? Society is an outgrowth of individuals. Individuals are not an outgrowth of a society. There could be no society without individuals in it. The other conflicting notion of human nature that the left portrays is that as soon as you become wealthy, you become evil. I mean, this is the other one, that if you own a business, and the moment that you sign your first paycheck on the to line, as soon as you sign somebody their first wage, you magically become an evil human being who has a Scrooge McDuck money bin in the back of your restaurant somewhere. And you're actively trying to deprive people of their livelihood. You know, until that point, you were a wonderful person, but the moment that you started employing somebody and hiring them and providing them a livelihood, you became evil. The second principle of conservatism is that individuals have rights that predate government. Now, it's very interesting. I think it was Matt Damon recently, the genius Matt Damon, who was talking about rights, and he said rights are guaranteed to us. They come from the Constitution. That's a nonsense statement. So before there was a Constitution, there were no rights. The Constitution magically came into being of its own accord and granted people rights. That's wonderful. The idea that rights come from government means that rights do not exist. If a right comes from a government, then it doesn't exist. The right believes that it comes from God or from nature, and that it is the divine spark in all of us that means that you have to respect somebody else's humanity. Because if we were to base it simply on the quality of other people, why would you respect anybody? I know a lot of stupid people. I know a lot of venal people. You know, the fact that they're stupid and venal doesn't mean that they are less human beings, because as a conservative, I believe that every human being has worth. And by the way, that every human being, unless they are physically or mentally incapable, is responsible for their actions. But if you believe that rights do not come from God or government, then you end up in a situation where the government randomly creates rights out of whole cloth. And those rights typically involve invading somebody else's rights. Because you have a godly soul, presumably, because you are an individual and your rights come from a higher power than government, nobody else is allowed to invade those rights. Which leads to the third principle, which is if you reject individual consequences, if you reject individual rights, you deny everybody else's rights. And this is the difference between rights on the left and rights on the right. According to the left, you may have heard this recently, we all have a right to health care. Right? We all have a right to health care. Let's explore that for a minute, what it means to have a right to health care. If you have a right to health care, I'm not talking about a right to access health care. A right to access health care, we all agree, you have a right to use your money however you want. But a right to actual health care means that if you're on the street and you have a broken leg and there's a doctor walking by, you can now pull out a submachine gun and force the doctor at point of gun to heal your leg. Right? Just like a right to housing means that if you don't have a house, you can find a contractor somewhere, stick a gun in his face, and tell him to build you a house free of charge, at his cost, because you have a right to housing. Any right that allows you to force someone else to provide for you the fulfillment of that right is not a right. It is you foisting your wants onto somebody else. And once you deny that there are individual rights that accrue to the individual, there's a difference between negative and positive rights. Negative rights are the idea of free speech. If I have a right to free speech, that does not give me the power to put my gun in your face. Right? Free speech just means that you don't get to put your gun in my face. The rights that are based on individuals are rights that are worthwhile. Rights that are based on a government granting them are rights that can either be taken away or perverted. And so those are really two principles, that individuals have rights from God or nature, and that if you reject individual consequences for individual actions, you're going to end up invading somebody else's rights. Because in the end, what you're going to say is, I'm not responsible for my actions, therefore you pay for me. Right? I'm not responsible for the decisions that I made in my life, therefore the state gets to come in and force you to do something for me. That's not how it works. The fourth principle for conservatives is that government was specifically created to protect these pre-existing rights, and the minute it invades those rights, it loses its legitimacy. Government was not created to fulfill all of your whims or all of your wants. Government was created to protect you from other people trying to invade your rights. And the minute government becomes that invader, the government becomes a problem, not a solution. And these basic principles, you have to understand that these undergird every single political argument that we have. Every single political argument has at its root this difference in world visions. And that fundamental gap goes to fundamental principles. And those fundamental principles mean that there really can be no agreement. And that's why it's important to discuss those and convince people with regard to fundamental principles, at least find out where people stand. Because if you're always arguing up here, then we can lie to ourselves and pretend that we're all on the same page, we just have different ideas about gay marriage. But if you are on the baseline level, then you begin to realize that there's something a little bit deeper than that going on, something a little bit more important than that going on. In order to achieve that discussion, though, the first thing you have to do, to get back to my original point, the first thing you have to do is get beyond the character arguments and character attacks that are so commonly used, which is, you're a bad person if. Those are worthless conversations. Those are conversations that are not worth having. The only kind of conversations that are worth having are conversations that are directed at the end goal of either clarifying a position or solving a problem. And if you're not doing either of those things, then you're not fulfilling your duty to have a decent and worthwhile conversation. That's time you're going to wish you had back when you're on your deathbed choking out your last breath. You're going to think that those 2 hours talking about pot policy were a big waste of time, because unfortunately they are.